Ashley Neal recently asked me a very interesting question about driving and zebra crossings, which will affect all of you because all of you that drive will come across a zebra crossing at some point, I presume. If you're not familiar with Ashley, I'll link his channel in the description below, the video specifically that I'm referencing, because I find it a very interesting question. Now, I say I find it a very interesting question. People that are fanatics about driving and driving instructors and so on are probably very interested in these questions, but generally where it applies to the law and the regulations, lawyers are really interested in these questions. So if you find this really interesting, you're either going to be a good candidate for a driving instructor or a lawyer. So bear with me. This is a really interesting one. So the question is, when you approach a zebra crossing and there is someone on the crossing, obviously you have to stop because they are on the crossing. You should stop if they are waiting to cross, but you have to stop if they are on the crossing. But the question is, do you have to wait for them to get all the way across before you can go? Because if they are on the right-hand side of the crossing, which will be illustrated in just a moment, if they're on the right-hand side of that crossing, you can get across without really putting them in danger. Is that okay? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this video. But first of all, let's hear it directly from Ashley first, and then I'll show you one or two examples from his video, and then we'll dive into where the law is, because it's not entirely straightforward, which does frustrate me because everyone has to comply with it, and yet it's not easy to find. Ashley is no stranger to looking for these things and couldn't find it, with all respect. So let's hear it from Ashley himself. Listen to this.
When you're approaching a zebra crossing and there are pedestrians using that crossing, do you have to wait until they're totally finished before you continue? We've got a zebra in front of us, and there's a lady who is about to cross. Perfect. This way round, we're going to have to let her cross. But if she was walking the other way, I might decide to go before she's reached the middle. What would you do in this situation?
And so that was one example, and there's a few more. You can watch the full video, but there's another example right at the end here. So let me jump to the end of the video and watch this, and then we'll jump into the law.
Thought is this though, how much time is this really gonna gain you?
So that's really what we're talking about here. Do you have to wait for them to fully cross the road before you can go? It might sound like a really simple question, but it's actually really important because it will be an offence if you're in the wrong. So without further ado, let's jump into the legislation here. So first of all, the overarching and framework legislation is the Zebra, Pelican and Puffing Pedestrian Crossing Regulations and General Directions 1997. That's the sort of framework, and that's where this comes from. So whilst this does appear here, I'm actually going to jump to the more specific regulations, which is the Traffic Signs Regulations and General Directions 2016, which is a statutory instrument, Schedule 14 to be specific, and Paragraph 7. You can see already that you have to be quite interested to actually find where these come from. I go for this one because I can highlight this because this is within my educational software. And just for good measure, when you jump into the highway code, you can see it here at 195 zebra and parallel crossings. You must give way to a pedestrian that's moved onto a crossing, etc. So let's move to the specific wording which creates this offence, and that will allow us to find the answer to this question. Every pedestrian who is on the carriageway within the limits of a zebra crossing, which is not for the time being controlled by a constable in uniform or traffic warden, before any part a vehicle has entered those limits, has precedence within those limits over that vehicle, and the driver must accord such precedence to any such pedestrian. So what's causing the confusion here is what the precedence means. Or that's really the red herring, because that's where it leads you to confusion and sort of obscure the real answer. Now, ordinarily, let's focus on the word precedence for a moment. If it was just the word precedence, we might, even as lawyers and even in court and in court documents, we might refer to the ordinary English meaning of the word. Precedence just means to give priority to, let them go first, give them precedence, let them go first. So if that were just the case, then it would be right that you could just let the pedestrian go first across the crossing and then you can just go because you have let them go first. That will be fine, but that's not the end of the matter. Because when we look again specifically at the wording, it is framed within the zebra crossing limits. Now, we need to find out what that means, because it says every pedestrian who is on the carriageway within the limits of a zebra crossing, so we need to know what those limits are, has precedence within those limits over the vehicle, and the driver must accord such precedence to any such pedestrian. So it is within those limits. So then we need to know, well, what does these limits mean? So in any piece of legislation, most pieces of legislation and statutory instruments, we have a definitions section. So when we look at definitions here for zebra crossing, which is under Schedule 1 for definitions, zebra crossing is a place on the carriageway which is a provision made for pedestrians to cross the carriageway, granted. The presence which is indicated by a yellow globe, so you see those globes at the side of the road, black and white stripes, and where used, the markings provided at item 55 of that table. And then the limits of which are indicated by the stripes, except that where used, the limit is indicated by the markings at item 55. Now, what on earth does that mean? So a zebra crossing is a provision, a crossing for pedestrians to cross the road, which has a yellow globe, which is provided for item 7 over the sign table. I'll come back to that in a second. Black and white stripes shown in the diagram at item 52 of the table in respect of which provision is made at paragraph 18, etc., etc. So we're going to look at what this diagram at item 52 means in a second, and where used, the marking provided at item 55 of that table. Now, that table is this one here, which is essentially a whole list of different things which have different diagrams, and they are literally, you can just about see them here. They are linked diagrams which show what it's referring to. And it's referring to these. So item 52, the stripes, which you'll be familiar with, is this bit here, and there's measurements, etc. And all the zigzag lines have got measurements and so on. And item 55 on that table are these little white squares. So where they are used, and they're not always used, but where they are used, they also indicate the limits of this zebra crossing. So the stripes from one side to the other, usually if it is all the way across, indicate the limits. And where they are used, these little square things, which will also go around the zebra crossing. So now if we move to some examples from Ashley's video, you can see this one zebra crossing here. You can see the yellow beacons. You can see the black and white stripes. And by the way, they don't have to be painted black and white if they don't fully comply with the requirements, but they are by and large the same distinction, black and white, for these stripes across, then they still comply with that rule. So on this example, you can see that there are not those little white squares going from one side to the other, just the stripes. And so in this example here, obviously the vehicles have to stop for pedestrians on the zebra crossing here, but there are no little white squares. If I move forward to about here, I think it is, you can see this example, and if I move back a little bit, you'll see it even more clearly. You can see the black and white stripes, but you can also see these white squares, which accord with this diagram here. So those are the white squares that we're talking about. And so the limits for this zebra crossing, as defined in the regulations, is not just the black and white stripes, but it is the whole of this area here. And so the wording here, in my view, is quite clear. And it says that every pedestrian on the carriageway within the limits of the zebra crossing has precedence within those limits over the vehicle. And so for the whole time that the pedestrian is within those limits, which will include any part of this all the way up to where these white squares are because they are used, the pedestrian has precedence over the vehicle. So the vehicle should not cross whilst the pedestrian is still within that space. And it will be the whole of that space because the wording would be taken quite literally in this sense. And so speaking of wording taken quite literally, I did try to find a case that used exactly these regulations, and I couldn't find one, but I did find a case that spoke specifically to Regulation 24, which deals with the prohibition of overtaking at a crossing. The driver of a vehicle shall not cause it or any part of it to pass ahead of the foremost part of any other motor vehicle proceeding in the same direction. Now, the key wording there was proceeding, because in this case here, the vehicles were not proceeding because they were stationary, and the appeal was allowed in this case. But the wording here was not to pass ahead of any vehicle proceeding in the same direction, or pass ahead of a vehicle which was stationary for the purposes of complying with Regulation 23 or 25 or 26, which was different because that's if someone's on the crossing, then obviously if they are stationary because they've stopped for someone crossing the road, then you can't overtake. But if there's no one on it and they are just stationary and you overtake, that does not contravene 24A because they are not proceeding because they are stationary. Legal technicality, I know, but that is just how the wording is very specifically applied. So here, the wording would be specifically applied in that the pedestrian has precedence within the limits over the vehicle, and the driver must accord such precedence to any such pedestrian. So that, in my view, is the answer to the question. Those are the limits of the zebra crossing, and the pedestrian has precedence within those limits if they're already on it by the time the driver comes along. And then the driver must wait whilst they are in those limits. So I hope that's helpful and answered a few questions. Do check out Ashley's video linked in the description below. I thank Ashley and his viewers for the question. And as always, thank you for watching.